Hi, my name is Sam. I'm a music instructor in Salt Lake City, Utah. I teach piano and voice lessons, and I play a whole host of other instruments at varying levels of competence, but I have fun playing all of them. The purpose of this video is to give an introduction to scales. You may have heard of a musical scale before, not like the thing that you weigh in on at the gym, not like the scales of a dragon or a fish. No, today we're talking about musical scales, much more like a staircase than any of the other two examples. Scales are the building blocks of virtually all music. There are some musics that do not involve pitch, a note that you could identify as having a specific frequency. That is D. For example, if you watch the Nick Cannon movie Drumline, if you watch a drumline perform, they'll have snare drums. And without getting too technical, yes, you can tune drums to a specific pitch. For example, the tenor drums, which is where you see the marching band where they've got like the whole carriage of like 4 or 5 drums, and they usually do have a pitch. Do 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 do. Like a Hawaii 5-0. Drums can be tuned, but if you think of it as a snare drum, what hits your brain in the sense of the sound waves is more so much like snapping. When you hear something snap, you're not really thinking about what note it is. You're really more just thinking about what rhythm they're playing. So use that loose definition to help you decide what is a pitched instrument and what is not a pitched instrument. So scales, unless it's like drumline or other percussion type instruments that don't have set pitches, really all of the music we play involves the organization of tones or sounds into patterns, because our brains have developed over millions of years through the process of evolution to recognize and benefit from the recognition of patterns. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors recognized that if a berry was a specific color, too light or too dark, then it wouldn't be safe to consume because you could get sick. And back in hundreds of thousands of years ago, getting sick collecting berries because you ate one that was not quite red enough or the wrong color red, you would just die. They didn't have doctors and things, you know what I'm saying? So scales involve musical patterns for the same exact reason. For some reason, without getting too sciencey, our brains love patterns, and music is full of patterns. In fact, when you come to voice or piano lessons, that's essentially all I'm doing, is teaching you how to recognize musical patterns, and then the techniques of your instrument involve different sorts of patterns. So scales are so important. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cherny before. Let me tell you a little bit about this person, extremely influential in the world of piano music. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, at the beginning of that century, there was a brand new instrument that was coming into vogue called the pianoforte or forte piano. Can't remember which off the top of my head. The point being that they called it the pianoforte because it could both be soft or loud. And that was a new development in the world of keyboard instruments. In the 18th century, those technologies were being developed and worked on, but it didn't really come into full prominence until people like Bach wrote the Well-Tempered Clavier to get people interested in the world of keyboard music. And then finally, with the works of Mozart, Haydn, and their contemporaries, we got what we would identify as the piano today. Further into the 19th century, some even more technical developments were made. And then by the end of the 1800s, let's say the 1880s, 1890s, the grand piano has essentially been the same ever since, in the way that it's constructed, in the rhetoric by which the tuning systems are devised, the pedal technology that allows us to sustain or mute certain pitches. Those technologies are actually really new. In the world of music, we think that these things that we grew up playing, piano and the Beatles and stuff, the reason those technologies are so fascinating to us is because they actually are extremely new in the grand spectrum of the world of historical music making. But what is not super new is scales. Let me play a scale for you. You've probably heard something like this throughout your life without recognizing it, perhaps. A scale is a collection of musical pitches that are organized into a recognizable pattern. We can recognize them both by analyzing what they look like in staff notated sheet music, as well as using our ears. Watch, I'll close my eyes and play a different scale. It'll be the same major scale, but it'll start on B flat instead of C. So I played. Now let me play the same scale. It will sound the same in terms of the pattern. You will recognize the pattern, but it will be starting on a different note. Did you see how I had my eyes closed that entire time? It's because I've learned to recognize both the muscle memory of my fingers on the keyboard as well as the sound. I can tell that this is not a major scale. In fact, that's what we would call a harmonic minor scale. So the huge part of music lessons, independent of the technique of your primary instrument, is basically just learning how to recognize those patterns. Could you hear that? Could you hear that was different than the major scale? They sounded different. One didn't sound better than the other. The way that we use scales is we take these patterns of pitches organized in a recognizable pattern, and we put them and write a song based on that melody. A great example of that would be something like Yankee Doodle, the American song. The song Yankee Doodle that I just played in the key of C major, which I'll explain later how that works, but you could tell that this was do, do, re, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, re, do. Yeah, and so Yankee Doodle is based off of the C major scale, this recognizable pattern. Did you see that the composer of Yankee Doodle wrote the song in such a way that the notes of the melody the melody Yankee Doodle is constructed out of the building blocks of each note of the C major scale. So, let me give you a little bit of a history lesson to describe how we got here, because scales didn't just pop out of nowhere. It took hundreds and thousands of years for people to develop our common understanding of how to use scales in a meaningful way in terms of building music, and not just building music like a brick house, but seriously learning how to build compelling, emotionally powerful melodies. A lot of people shy away from practicing their scales because it's boring, or it's not, I want to play the real music. They say, oh, that's pretty, I want to do that, but I don't want to practice my scales. Guess what? That piece I just played by Robert Schumann, the Opus 28 Romance in F sharp major, is in the key of F sharp major. So when I practice a piece that's in F sharp major, I practice the scale that beautiful melody is based off of. F major scale. F sharp major, sorry. Now, the second thing you heard me play these when I'm skipping notes, sounds like you're playing musical hopscotch. That's called arpeggiation. An arpeggio is when you take a chord and you just break it up into each individual note. So instead of talking about today is scales. So arpeggios will be the topic of a different video, but they are very related. Point being, if you want to learn how to play a song, a great way to practice is before you start learning the actual notes of the given melody, start playing the scale. And that's what I'll be teaching you to do in our piano lessons. And if you're a voice student, same thing. If we're singing a song that is in the key of E flat major, then we will learn how to sing in a solfege. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, mi, sol, do, so, mi, do. That's something I'll have you do as a singer. Doesn't matter what your primary instrument is, the musical concepts of scales, chords, theory, that's all the same. Okay, some history for you. Liar, liar, pants on fire. No, not L-I-A-R, L-Y-R-E. In ancient Greece, which is one of the civilizations that is most responsible for the culture and philosophy upon which our modern Western societies are based. Western meaning, the cultures that were influenced by European politics, culture, religion, art, music, etc. That does not mean that Western culture is better. It just means if you're coming to take voice lessons with me, I'm going to be teaching you scales based off of ancient Greece philosophical traditions, not the ancient scales that come from the Indian subcontinent, for example, or in Malaysia. There are countries that are not subject to European colonial mindsets that have an entirely different system of rhetoric, philosophy, and explanation for how music works. And it doesn't make them better or worse. It just is important for you to know that the purpose of this video, when I'm talking about scales, I am talking about European scales. Ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Babylon to an extent, but basically most music history in terms of European culture starts with ancient Greece. There's a little bit of Babylon, but it really starts with Greece. Okay, the lyre. You probably heard of that before. It's like a harp. It's like a handheld harp. Like the boombox that you can put on your shoulder instead of like big speakers. It's like the boombox version of a harp. So a harp, you sit on the floor and you rest between your legs and then you play the beautiful harp. A lyre is like a baby harp, like a ukulele to a guitar. They're both amazing instruments, worthy of respect and study. So a lyre, in ancient Greece, they had these amazing instruments called a lyre. It was also called, the Greek name was a tetrachordon, tetra meaning four. If it's not too triggering to bring up your high school geometry class, you'll remember that a tetrahedron is a geometric figure that has is based on fours. Like an octahedron would be 8, right? So tetrachordon means 4 chords. And instead of chords like this, it just meant there were 4 strings on the lyre, and you could play those 4 chords, and it sounded like this in ancient Greece, more or less. So again, you hear those, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 strings. So they had an instrument that was based on that sound, which we call a tetrachord, because the instrument was called a tetrachordon, 4 notes. Right. So that instrument went on to inspire a lot of people to write about why different notes, when they sound together, sound interesting or sad or happy, or a whole host of different ideas about what music sounds like to us. The music that sounded happy and fun and exciting to people in medieval France sounds a lot different than Dua Lipa and White Claw and you know what I'm saying? White Claw is the drink, Yellow Claw is the DJ. Get those confused frequently. But you know what I'm saying? It's like if you go to a club today, it's going to sound a little bit different than the medieval court of James VIII, because they had different notions about what music could be, what music ought to be, and what it's supposed to sound like. Music is very much a discipline of philosophy, meaning you have to be able to explain why what you're doing makes sense in a given context. So they have this tetrachordon and they play a tetrachord, which is what philosophers called the musical intervals that sound like that instrument. Or. Can you hear how that's the same pattern. No matter what starting note, it's that same pattern of intervals. An interval is when you have a single pitch and then you play a second pitch. You can hear that there's a relationship there. Basically what's happening, I'll give you a tiny bit of science, is that the sound waves that make your ears recognize these different notes have different proportions and ratios. They have different relationships of which frequencies get boosted so that our ears hear them and which frequencies kind of fall out before they hit our ears to be perceived as notes. Your ears have some complex anatomy that allows us to detect vibrations in the air around us, and we decipher and perceive those vibrations in the air as musical pitch. We can determine sing do, do. The reason we're both able to sing do together and get the same note result is the same reason that, unless you're colorblind, it's the same reason that you can look at this sticky note and we can agree that this is in somewhere in the realm of the color orange. I don't know what the lighting makes this look like, but to me, that is an orange sticky note. And this would be, in contrast, a more yellow sticky note. It's the same thing with music. You can tell that this is C and that this is C sharp. C sharp. That's called perfect pitch if you can do that without a piano. I don't have that. My mom does, and it's really cool. But since I don't have perfect pitch, I have to look at a piano to get what we would call a reference pitch. So this would be my reference pitch. That's B flat. But once you have a reference pitch, no matter what kind of talent your ears were born with, if you have a reference pitch, you should be able to identify a second note on top or below that starting note and be able to determine the interval, the relationship between the two notes. Back to geometry, I'm so sorry. Do you remember Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem? Well, this philosopher, because back in then they didn't really have mathematicians, they would just call themselves philosophers, and they would study science. It's like Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, if you read the British copy of those books. That's a philosopher back in ancient times wasn't, like Nietzsche or Immanuel Kant, where we think about people talking about, what is the right way to organize society? That term of philosophy came later. The ancient philosophers were mathematicians and musicians and poets and things like that. And they all had different ideas about what philosophy could accomplish. They would use philosophy to determine the organization of the stars and the cosmos, things like that. So Pythagoras, in addition to his various contributions to the world of modern mathematics, he also contributed to the world of music through a discovery he made on an instrument called a monochord. Mono meaning one. You'll remember that the lyre that ancient Greece players would be frequently playing was a tetrachord on 4 chords. Well, Pythagoras had this instrument called a monochord, which is essentially, you can think of like if you had a banjo and you only had one string, or like a guitar, just like one single string held at tension. If it's not held at tension, you can't pluck the string and create a resonant note. It has to be held at tension in order for you to pluck the string. So he had a monochord, and what he discovered is if you have a guitar string that is 2 feet long, we'll say, it will create a certain pitch. We'll say C, right? And if you take that 2 feet string and you make a cut, if you cut that string exactly in half so that you have 1 foot and 1 foot, if you press down that string on the monochord or a guitar with 1 string exactly halfway through the point of tension, it will result in what we call an octave. Can you hear that these are both the note C, but one is higher than the other? Well, Pythagoras our modern music is based off of Pythagoras' discovery that intervals, the relationship between one note and a note higher or lower than it, basically comes down to math. It's so funny to me because a lot of people will come to my voice and piano studio and say, I'm so glad I'm taking music lessons with you now because I really don't like math. And I just kind of chuckle a little bit because music is essentially just physics and math and science. And think about rhythm. All we're doing is counting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We're just doing all of sorts of math all the time. It's just we apply math in a way that sounds cool. We had this dichotomy, especially most of my students come from America. We had this dichotomy in America between STEM and arts. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So you're either into robotics and physics and calculus and engineering and computer science and programming, or you're into music and sculpture and pottery and art and drawing and graphic design. That could not be less true. Like, that is a fake barrier, and we need to tear that barrier down. I'm trying to accomplish that as a musician because there's a lot of scientists and mathematicians that love music, but there's not as many artists that love math, right? I'm trying to help solve that problem by helping kids especially realize that music is not an escape from math and science so that they don't have to do their calculus homework. No, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, can't you see what your math teachers are trying to tell you is that those principles are actually really cool and that you can apply them in very amazing and spectacular ways. That's essentially what producers are doing in a music studio, is figuring out different mathematic formulae to figure out how to make a singer sound really good. That's how microphones work. We used to have wax cylinders that would just record the vibrations of an opera singer, and then it would sound more or less like the opera singer. But now we have digital music that uses mathematical formulas to kind of like predict what a voice or a trombone sounds like and put that into a computer and replicate that with amazing fidelity, so much so that the untrained ear can't even tell if it was created in a studio or created in an acoustic environment. Isn't that crazy? Anyways, so Pythagoras, his discovery was that if you have a string and you hold it at tension, you can play a musical note, that intervals can be determined based on different mathematical ratios. This is a different ratio of like how much of the string you would cut, and this is a different ratio, and this is a different ratio. The octave is a very important ratio because it's essentially twice the frequency. So if one note is vibrating at a certain frequency, let's say it's A440. This note that I just played is called A4. It is the most common note used for tuning in an orchestra. Some people adjust the frequency a little bit lower or higher depending on their preference, but at least in America, I believe A440 is the standard. It's called A440 because 440 is the amount of times that a full sound wave will travel in a cycle. So it will do one, like it'll go up and it'll go down. It'll do that 440 times per second, which is a scientific measurement that we refer to as hertz. So this would be 440 hertz. Well, you remember how Pythagoras had that string and he cut it in half and it was exactly an octave higher? That mathematical relationship, guess what? The math doesn't stop. If you play A440 and you play the next A up, A880, it's twice the frequency. So A440 does 440 full sound wave cycles per second. A880 does 880. You know what I'm saying? Isn't that so fascinating? You didn't think that music could be so cool when you talk about math, but I promise it's amazing. Okay, so I've given you a pretty lengthy history lesson, and we really should start learning how to do the scales. So we're going to start with the major scale. And remember, when I say major or minor, all those words are just qualifying adjectives that help prepare our brain to recognize a pattern. This is a major scale. I've already played it for you several times, but listen, just close your eyes and listen to what it sounds like and begin to recognize that pattern. Okay, here's another major scale, this time starting on B natural. Again, all a scale is just a organized pattern of intervals. The two major intervals you need to be familiar with, the two primary intervals, I should say, that you need to be familiar with at first. You need to be aware of all of them at some point. But to start with a half step and a whole step. A half step is when you start a note on the piano and you go immediately one note up or immediately one note down. That's a half step. If you skip a note and have one note in between, we call that a whole step. Can you hear the difference between that? Do, re, do. That was a whole step. This is a half step. Do, ti, do. Does that make sense? Again, a whole step is when you play one note on the piano and skip a note in either direction. That's a whole step, and this is a half step. Can you hear the difference between those two? Those are the two primary intervals upon which scales are based. So, if you were to play a scale, and you can think of a scale as like a staircase where each note represents a stair on the staircase. You can go up the staircase, you can go down the staircase. If you went up a musical staircase or you played a musical scale that was developed only out of whole steps, we call that the whole tone scale, and it sounds like I'm about to hypnotize you or put you to sleep. Every note in that staircase, I was basically like skipping a step on the staircase and only doing whole steps, whereas every interval is where you skip one black key on the piano. Again, it sounds like this. You will now practice your scales every day, and it sounds like you're being hypnotized. If you play a musical scale and the staircase, instead of whole steps, the staircase is completely half steps, we call that the chromatic scale. Chroma is like color, right? You think of chromatic as like the color wheel. Well, in music, we do something similar. The chromatic scale is when you go from a note to its octave neighbor. These are both C, and you play every note on the piano in between those two notes, which means you travel only in half steps. That's called a chromatic scale. It sounds like this. Did you hear how there's different intervals? All of these are intervals that can be identified and studied. We have a starting note, and then we have intervals. To summarize, whole step is when you go on the piano and you skip a note, and you can go down in whole steps too. Okay, and then the chromatic scale is when you build a scale only off of half steps. But that's funny though, because scales usually have 8 notes, or 7 really. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8 is just the octave. Does that make sense? So to build a major scale, we need to learn the pattern of intervals that will allow us to play this scale with fidelity and recognize that pattern no matter what note we start on. You start on any given note, and the pattern is as follows. Again, all of this is not something I'm expecting you to just memorize immediately after one time watching this video. I got a college degree studying the stuff I'm presenting here, so don't feel hard on yourself if you're like totally not with me. That's why you come to piano or voice lessons, is so that I can explicate these processes further in a way that helps you as an individual understand it. So let me try. You start with a starting note, and then you do a whole step. Starting note, whole step, half step. Listen, that was a half step. Okay, another whole step, half step, and you're going to end on that same note. Half step. Again, starting note, whole step. Oh, that was a half step. Sorry. Bad demonstration. Let me demonstrate one more time. Got lost in the sauce. Starting note, whole step, half step. That's a half step. Starting note, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. If we were going down, it would be the starting note, then a half step, then a whole step, then a whole step, then a whole step, then a half step, whole step, and then a whole step down, and you finish. Does that make sense? That is so cool. So going back to Pythagoras' monochord, the guitar with just one string, you can figure out different sorts of musical intervals and arrange them into scales. The reason we start with the major scale for most students is that it's kind of the scale that if you learn that scale, then you will be prepared to begin recognizing and learning other scales in relationship to that scale. The Greek word for the major scale, it wasn't always called the major scale. The Greek word for it is the Ionian, I-O-N-I-A-N. You've probably heard of Ionian architecture, right? So the Ionian scale is when you start on a starting note and do that combination of intervals. Starting note, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That's the Ionian mode, or the major scale. You will hear me use both interchangeably because they mean the same thing. Bonus points, if you're still listening, I'll give you the pattern for a minor scale, or what we would call the Aeolian mode. So if you play a major scale, you can build a minor scale on the same note. This is B flat. You can build a Aeolian scale, the minor scale, with this pattern of whole steps and half steps. Starting note, whole note, half note. Let me start again. I shouldn't say note, I should say step. Starting note, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. Again, starting note, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. Did you hear how that was a distinctly different musical pattern of intervals than the major scale? Let me play the major scale. And now I'll play the minor scale, the natural minor scale, or Aeolian mode, starting on the same exact note, B flat, but with a different pattern of half steps and whole steps. Did you hear the difference? Let me do it in a different key. Well, I'll do it in G. We'll start in G major. Okay, this is G minor. Or the Aeolian mode, starting on G. G Aeolian, or G minor. Okay, hopefully that makes a lot of sense. And if it doesn't, that's totally okay. Like I said, it's 100% understandable and totally okay if you feel absolutely overwhelmed with the information I presented in this video. Let me try to summarize it real quick before I end the video. And then when you come to your next lesson, we should be able to discuss your questions, comments, and concerns so that I can better understand how to help you make this from this esoteric, what the heck is he talking about, to making real, beautiful music. That was an example of the musical genre known as the blues, which uses a different scale than the major or minor scale. It uses what we call the blues scale. I'll teach you that later. The point is, if you practice your scales, which I'll help you learn to do in a different video on how to actually practice the stuff I've presented, then if you practice your scales, you'll be able to apply the scales you're practicing to the music that brings joy to your life. I am never going to give you scales to practice out of a sense of punishing you or torturing you, which is a lot of students feel. It's like, oh, I want to get to the good stuff. I don't want to do scales. What I'm telling you is, that's fine. I can't force you to drink, but I will lead you to the water. And the water of everlasting musical life is practicing your scales. So hopefully I've kind of made my case. We started today learning about how scales are the building blocks of virtually all music, unless it's deliberately a sort of genre of music like percussion, drumline stuff, where it's not about the notes, it's just about the rhythm, or like West African drum circles in dance. Much more about the rhythm and the relationship between notes organized into time rather than the notes organized into music. So we talked about ancient Greece and how they had the tetrachordon, the four-stringed lyre that sounds like this. One thing I'll mention that I did mention earlier is, did you hear how the major scale is based on the notes that the ancient Greeks would have played on the tetrachordon? You basically stack two tetrachords on top of each other and it sounds like this. This is a tetrachord. And then to play a major scale, you just play two tetrachords. Isn't that so cool? The music that we are playing today, Justin Bieber, Selena Gomez, Dua Lipa, Frank Ocean, Kendrick Lamar, is based on music from ancient Greek philosophers like Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, etc. And so, and funny, a little bit of extra history, Plato actually believed that there were certain modes, like there were certain scales you could play. There are different scales you could play that were actually conducive to societal illness. Like you could play a certain. It's like the modern argument today is based on Plato of like, oh, rap music isn't real music because it inspires violence and aggression, or metal music, we can't let our kids listen to this because it will disturb them. And my advice for that is just to know who you're listening to. There's metal music that contains lyrics that challenge society in a really productive way. And there's metal lyrics that do kind of fulfill that stereotype of parents like, oh, I'll never let my kids listen to that because they're talking about all these evil things. Just know what you're listening to, but don't limit yourself to thinking that a certain genre of music is good or bad, because Plato did that, and he was a pretty smart guy, but I think that was one thing that was wrong with Plato. So we also talked about how Pythagoras discovered using his monochord, his single note guitar, that if you cut the string of that guitar into different intervals, you can play different notes and define those mathematical relationships. Next, we talked about the major scale, or the Ionian mode, as being like the first scale you should really sink your teeth into. You start on a note and you play a pattern of half steps and whole steps. Half step is when you play a note on the piano and you go up or down one key. Don't skip keys. Whole steps are when you play a note on the piano and then you do skip exactly one key. You skip this one, that would be a half step, and you go immediately to this, C to D, C down to B flat. Those are whole steps, and remember, that's the hypnotizing. So whole and half steps are how we form scales. The major scale is based on this pattern. Starting note, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. The minor scale, or the Aeolian mode, similar to the major scale in the sense that there are 8 notes that you would play, 7 notes, and then the 8th note is the top note, which repeats at that octave when you cut the monochord in half. And the only difference between Aeolian and Ionian, minor and major, is just which pattern of half and whole steps you include in which order. So for minor, it would be starting note, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, right? That was different. This is major, or Ionian. This is minor, or Aeolian. Make sense? The conclusion. Why scales? I think I've already made my point. I'm not going to try to sell. If I haven't sold you in the last 35 plus minutes, then I'm probably not going to ever sell you. Scales are essential. If you want to get better at music, you will practice scales. Doesn't matter if you like Lana Del Rey, or Kendrick Lamar, or Kanye West, or Beethoven, or the Beatles, or Fleet Foxes. If you want to play that music, they are all using principles from these ancient Greek philosophers, okay? Let me read you a quote from Carl Cherny. I don't think I ever explained who Carl Cherny was. I can't remember. Carl Cherny was a immensely important pedagogue, a teacher of piano. He studied with Beethoven. Imagine having Beethoven as your piano teacher. Probably doesn't get much better than Beethoven as your piano teacher. He studied with Beethoven, and then he was the teacher of Franz Liszt, who is another one of like the Mount Rushmore, like most important piano composers. So Carl Cherny, you don't recognize his name as being like a composer. It's like, oh, I'm going to go to the symphony tonight and hear Carl Cherny. What you do hear is that almost every piano player you've ever heard playing classical music, like Beethoven, Liszt, Brahms, Ravel, probably at some point in their life had a teacher that made them learn out of the Cherny books. So this is not a Cherny book per se, it's a book about scales. And Carl Cherny says, "Do you ask me how good a player you may become? Then tell me how much you practice the scales." I think I'll end with that today. Please leave a comment if you have any questions, and if you are one of my in-person actual voice or piano students, I'd love to answer any of your questions the next time I see you in person. Thanks so much, and we'll see you for now.